We are here in Omaha, Nebraska this morning with Warren Buffett, the chairman and CEO of Berkshire Hathaway. With Warren Buffett, the chairman and CEO of Berkshire Hathaway. With Warren Buffett. We are here in Omaha, Nebraska this morning with Warren Buffett, the chairman and CEO of Berkshire Hathaway.
All right, sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened, but the stream just ended suddenly. All right, thank you guys for pointing that out. I believe we were on this slide, and just all I was saying here is that there are. Was that right? What were we talking about here? Oh, in the alveolus, right. Uh, we will see CO2 that's dissolved in the plasma diffuse freely into the alveolus. Because the partial pressure at the arterial end is 45 millimeters mercury for CO2, and in the alveolus it'll be 40 millimeters mercury. So always we'll see diffusion from an area of high P partial pressure to an area of low partial pressure. And as always, as blood travels along the tissue through the capillary, it has time to exchange gases and equilibrate until the blood at the venous end resembles the tissue partial pressure. And so we'll see a partial pressure of CO2 of 40 millimeters mercury at the venous end, and that mirrors the 40 millimeters mercury partial pressure of CO2 in the alveolus. So again, that CO2 diffuses freely from the plasma. Also, we will see bicarbonate move back into the red blood cell, and thanks to carbonic anhydrase, be converted to bicarbonate and then back to CO2 and H2O. That CO2 is then free to diffuse into the alveolus, and then CO2 will also be released from the hemoglobin, the carbaminohemoglobin that held CO2 will release it, and that CO2 will diffuse freely into the alveolus. So for lifespan changes, you're going to see fewer ciliated epithelial cells, and the cilia become less active. This means that mucus will thicken. You're also going to get a chronic cough because just like smokers, fewer cilia functioning means the mucus doesn't get moved up to the esophagus as efficiently. And so you have to cough to compensate. We're also going to see that swallowing, gagging, and coughing reflexes will slow. The macrophages found in the lungs are going to lose their efficiency, which makes you more susceptible to respiratory infections. And then breathing may require more effort because the costal cartilages stiffen. Remember, those are the cartilages that attach the anterior parts of the ribs to the sternum. They'll stiffen, and then postural changes will change the shape of the thoracic cavity. Connective tissue is going to replace muscle in the bronchioles, which makes them less able to dilate. The bronchial walls will also thin and not open as much, which means we're going to see increased resistance to airflow. Okay, less air will flow through the bronchioles and the bronchi. The alveolar walls will thin and the alveoli will merge as we age. And remember, just like with emphysema, when the alveoli fuse together, we lose the walls that separated them. And if you lose the walls that separate them, then you lose surface area for gas exchange. All right, so that was it for respiratory. Let's move on to digestive. Do we have any questions at this point before we move on to digestive? All right. Well, I'm going to keep moving, but if you guys do have questions, you can shoot them up there at any point, and I'll look over occasionally at the monitor to check in on that. All right. So, the digestive system is a long tube that extends through the entire body. One way to think about it is that humans are kind of like a donut. There is a hole that passes all the way through a donut, and there is a hole that passes all the way through humans. So the digestive system is also known as the GI tract, gastrointestinal tract, or the alimentary canal. And again, this is a muscular tube that passes from the mouth to the anus all the way through. And one interesting thing is that technically the inside of the GI tract is outside the body. All right. Just like the center of a donut is outside the donut, the center of the GI tract is outside the body. All right, so good. The pH, electrolyte composition, and water volume of the internal environment, that is in our tissues, is going to be carefully regulated. But these will change drastically in the digestive tube according to the food that we eat. Food materials that enter the digestive tube get broken down into their building blocks. So we break them down into sugars, amino acids, fatty acids, and glycerol. The building blocks get absorbed across the wall of the tube, particularly in the small intestine. And then once absorbed, these building blocks are used to create all of the molecules that we need. All right, so digestion is the mechanical and chemical breakdown of foods into forms that cell membranes can absorb. So mechanical is a physical breakdown. The mechanical digestion is a physical breakdown of large particles into smaller ones, but it doesn't change the chemical composition of the food. Chemical digestion chemically breaks down food particles by changing them into simpler chemicals. And so, an example of mechanical digestion would be like chewing, right? You've got a slice of pizza and you don't just swallow it whole. Most of us don't. Did read an interesting story last night about a guy who used to literally swallow knives, but anyway, you don't swallow pizza whole, you chew it, and you break it down into smaller pieces. This is mechanical digestion or a physical breaking up of the food. The liquid portion, or we may call it the aqueous component of saliva, also helps break down food into smaller portions and help bind it into balls that we call a bolus. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Uh, Chemical digestion would be like the enzymes in saliva that break down carbohydrates, primarily salivary amylase. Amylase will break down complex carbohydrates, um, will start to break down complex carbohydrates. And so chemical digestion actually begins in the mouth. That's another interesting point with salivary amylase. That's the first enzyme to chemically break down food. So the digestive system consists of the organs of the digestive system. We've got the esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, as well as accessory organs which aid in digestion. All right, so they carry out mechanical and chemical digestion, as well as ingestion, which is the process of bringing food in, propulsion, which is the process of moving food through the body, and then absorption, which occurs mostly in the small intestine where we absorb the building blocks. And then defecation, which is the elimination or removal of waste material. The digestive system consists of the alimentary canal, which we mentioned, that tubular structure that passes from mouth to anus, and the accessory organs. All right, now the alimentary canal, you can see it here plainly. Beginning in the mouth, we pass into the pharynx, the esophagus, down into the stomach, from the stomach down into the small intestine, and from there into the large intestine, up, over, down, some curves, and then out. Okay. One muscular tube passes all the way through. Okay. And so well, we talked about the organs. The accessory organs include the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas, all of which produce digestive enzymes that will aid in breaking down. They'll aid in chemical digestion in the small intestine. Here you can see it again. We have all right. Some of the structures. It begins with the tongue, which helps physically digest food by moving it into a bolus, also moving it toward the teeth so that they can physically break it down. We have the esophagus, which is just a muscular tube that conveys food down to the stomach. Then in the stomach, of course, you're familiar with it. Here we have acids. We also have digestive enzymes. All right, we move from here down into the small intestine. Now, attached to the small intestine are the gallbladder and the pancreas, which will produce digestive enzymes, as well as the gallbladder releasing bile, which will help emulsify fats and help with their absorption. The beginning of the small intestine is the duodenum, and it's a fairly short region. We move from there into the much larger jejunum, and then finally the larger ileum, which is the distal or third portion of the small intestine. From there, we pass into the large intestine, also known as the colon, and we move through the ascending, the transverse, and the descending colon before finally reaching the sigmoid colon, the rectum, the anus, and then passing out of the body. One interesting thing to look at this, to note about this picture, all right, is that the small intestine is about 6 meters in length. Okay? The small intestine is about 6 meters in length. What is that in feet? Multiply by 3. That's less than 20 feet. That's about 20 feet, maybe. All right, so you may have heard some crazy stories that the small intestine could, if removed from a person's body, could stretch from here to the moon or could wrap around the earth. These are very popular urban legends. It's not true. Um, Only about 20 feet long. All right, now, what else about the small intestine? Oh, there are a couple other urban legends we'll talk about when we get there. All right, so there are 4 layers found in most of the GI tract. They are the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis, and the serosa. Now, the mucosa is the innermost layer, and it's a mucous membrane. And you probably know that mucous membranes consist of an epithelial layer and a connective tissue layer, typically like loose areolar connective tissue. Now, this is the layer that's going to face the lumen of the GI tract, or in other words, this is the layer that's going to be in contact with the food. Deep to that, or moving away from the lumen, we have the submucosa, and the submucosa is a connective tissue that's highly vascularized, and it nourishes the cells and then transports absorbed food molecules. There is a limited amount of there's a small amount of smooth muscle here. The smooth muscle here is involved in compressing capillaries and keeping things moving through the capillaries. The muscularis here, the next deep layer, is a bit thicker, and there's quite a bit of smooth muscle here. And the smooth muscle is responsible for moving the tube itself, but mainly for moving the food materials. All right, and then the outermost layer is the serosa, which is a serous layer. We'll have a visceral and a parietal layer, and then serous fluid in between. It's a serous membrane. All right, so if we look here, here's a section of what looks like small intestine, and the inside is going to be lined with mucosa. And so we see the mucosa here. Yes, this is small intestine because you can see these large villi. All right, and they're going to be lined with epithelium at the apical surface, and then deep to that, some areolar connective tissue. Okay. Deep to the mucosa is the submucosa, which is a highly vascularized connective tissue. There's a small amount of smooth muscle in here, depending on which part of the GI tract you're in. And then you move into the muscularis, which is a thick muscular layer. And there are 2 layers in the muscularis, comprised of circular muscle and longitudinal muscle that contract in different directions to either squeeze the food or propel it down the line. And then the outermost layer, outermost as in away from the lumen of the GI tract, is the serosa. And in the serosa, that's where you find the serous membrane that surrounds the alimentary canal. Now, one more thing to see before we move on. You have these villi here, these large finger-like projections. These are found in the small intestine only. And what they do is they increase the surface area for absorption. Okay? Now, you see this little box here. We're going to zoom in on the right to see this, and you can see that areolar connective tissue here. You can see the lacteal here, that lymphatic capillary. You can then see the blood capillaries surrounding the lacteal. Remember, the lacteal is only found in the small intestine. It's for absorbing and transporting dietary fats. Then we zoom in a little bit more. You got this box here, and you can see the epithelia here. We have goblet cells producing mucus. And then we have microvilli on the surface of the epithelial cells. So the epithelial cells have microvilli, which increase their surface area, and then lots of cells with microvilli make up a villus. All right, one of these villi. All right, so through a combination of the microvilli and then the villi, and then these structures called plicae circularis, or the circular folds of the intestine, all of these three structures increase the surface area of the small intestine. And one cool thing, and you can go ahead and quote this to your friends, is that this is actually interesting and it's true, is that the surface area for absorption in the small intestine, even though the small intestine is only about 20 feet long, the surface area inside of it for absorption is actually large enough to cover a tennis court. That is true. The intestines won't stretch to the moon, but the surface area for absorption inside them is large enough to cover a tennis court. All right, so we've got two types of movements in the alimentary canal. We've got mixing movements and propelling movements. And the mixing movements um, don't move the materials, but they do mix them together. And so you can see this in the churning of the stomach, okay, where we have stomach acid and we have food, and we will churn the stomach to mix them together, the acid, the enzymes, and the food. Okay. Propelling movements will move material down the line. And so down here, we have peristalsis. And peristalsis is where you have a bolus of food or ingested material here. And then just behind the bolus, we'll see contraction of the smooth muscle. When we do that, we push the bolus forward. Okay? And if we continue to contract down the line, we will continue to push the bolus forward. Okay, you can see this wave of contraction continues. Peristalsis is taking place all the time. It's pretty constant. It's pretty cool. Let me go ahead and pull up a picture. I've got a video, I think, which should show this. I did an ultrasound. All this year I've been doing ultrasounds on mice, and I've got a video of the intestines in action. Trying to find that. Oop, I'm getting close. Here we go. Is this it? Yes. Perfect. Okay. Let me switch back. You see, this will repeat. It's a little blurry, but this movement, we get the cursor back. This movement, the large, obvious one, this is contraction of the diaphragm. On the left is the thoracic cavity, and as the diaphragm contracts, it drops and then increases the volume of the thoracic cavity. Over here on the right, these wriggling, writhing tubes, these are the intestines. Okay, and so you can see that the intestines, at least in the mouse here, are constantly contracting and pushing that food forward through the intestines. Very cool. We don't typically feel that, and if you think back to the whatchamacallit, nervous nervous system unit, we have pain receptors coming from the organs And we may sometimes be conscious of pain in the viscera, but we don't have other types of receptors um, in the viscera that reach the somatic nervous system. We aren't able to feel distension usually, unless it reaches the point of pain. If it triggers pain, we can be consciously aware of it, we can perceive it, but just minor distension and movement in the intestines we're typically not aware of. All right, cool stuff. So moving on, let's go ahead and pause that. Okay, those were propelling movements. So for innervation of the GI tract, we see branches of the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system that extensively innervate the alimentary canal. So you have the submucosal plexus, which is a plexus of nerve fibers that run through the submucosa, and then you have the myenteric plexus, which is a complex network of fibers that runs through the myenteric level, or the muscularis level. So autonomic control of the digestive activity involves parasympathetic impulses, which will increase the activities of the digestive system. Remember, the parasympathetic system is your rest and digest system, and so that'll be largely controlled by the parasympathetic system. GI activities will be controlled by the parasympathetic system. Sympathetic impulses will inhibit digestive actions, okay, such as secretion and motility. Motility is movement in the GI tract. Now, this seems kind of obvious if you think about it. When it's time to rest and digest, parasympathetic nervous system kicks into action, keeps things going. When you see a saber-toothed tiger, your sympathetic nervous system kicks into action, and you go fight or flight. And are you going to keep digesting and worrying about that? No. Um, Basically, you see a saber-toothed tiger, and then at that point, you're going to stop digesting. The sympathetic nervous system turns off digestion, and uh, that's okay. Because either you run or fight and survive the encounter, and then you can digest later, or you don't survive the encounter and it really doesn't matter. So, yeah, you turn off digestion in a fight or flight situation. All right, so in total, we've been going for about an hour now. I'm going to go ahead and pause it here at slide 10. Do we have any questions so far? Okay, doesn't look like we have any questions. Remember, you can email me anytime, and I will try and get back to you quickly. This last weekend, we had a number of birthdays, and so I've been slow getting back to people since this last weekend. I'll catch up on that today. All right, if you have any questions, yes, email me, and I'll be happy to get back to you. All right, we'll pick it up here on Tuesday. No, Thursday? Yeah, Thursday.